Okay, are we up? Lucio, I really enjoyed your presentation. I think it's very good, and we're on the same wavelength in many areas. Your approach is definitely from the system science perspective, an engineering and pragmatic perspective of real problems in the real world. My views are very complementary to yours, but I come from a different philosophical source as well as a different logical source. So my concern is that of the natural sciences and the role of emergence in the natural sciences. The flaws that you identified, Lucille, in the application of Simon's ideas, or in general, the mathematical difficulties encountered from chaos theory, catastrophe theory, and other aspects of modularity are what drove me in part to the definition of organic mathematics. How do we get around some of these issues in this concept of emergence? Now, historically, the notion of emergence came from the work of J.S. Mills, and his leading example from that was the relationship between hydrogen and oxygen and water. And for him, the emergent properties of water relative to the properties of hydrogen and oxygen were what led him to coin the notion of heteropathy and the relative logics of heteropathy. And these generate from the concept of this irregularity, and the contrast heteropathy with homopathy. That is, things that are all different from each other versus things that are the same from each other. For him, Mills, that is, the atoms of hydrogen and oxygen were fundamentally different from the properties of water. And so this was the original roots of the notion of emergence. And these are what I go back to come up with the categorizations of third order biocybernetics. So my entire, the views that have been adopted come from extension of various scientific and philosophical concepts to the applications of biology. And this is the biocybernetics. Within cybernetics, the role of biology, or I should say, the role of cybernetics in biology is profound and deep and persuasive and virtually everywhere. How from a chemical or biochemical point of view, the regulations that are necessary, the rules, the cyclic processes are intrinsic to the description of not only the biochemical processes that go on, but in the cycle of life, etc. So that this part is good. Now I have to figure out how to go to the next screen here. Oh, here we go. So I'll go through some of these slides quickly because Lucille has already covered many of the same things that I wanted to say, but I put them into a different, if you would, language. As background for the series of slides, I will have two boxes in the middle that predominate. The one on the left is taken to be the system, and the one on the right is taken to be some sort of description of the system. The method, the style of these slides is patterned after the work of Robert Rosen and category theoretical analysis from a mathematical side of things or an abstraction side of things. So this slide on the left or the box on the left here simply notes that one starts with a simple cell. The cell grows and doubles in size, and then it divides. And so that's sort of the underlying dynamic perspective of the mathematics of third order biocybernetics. The question is, how do we get from inorganic material to organic material? That is, the antecedent inorganic stuff, that is nutrients from the environment, result in the organic consequence of life itself. There's a number of logical consequences that are necessary to be formed if this is to occur from an abstract point of view or a chemical point of view. So on the bottom of the slide, we have dictionaries of terms, which come from the notations. Now, this is crucial. The dictionary of terms come from the notations of the sciences. So you have mathematical notations, physical notations, chemical notations, biological notations. These are expressed in terms of what Lucille calls theories. So you have mathematical theories of catastrophe and chaos. You have physical theories of energy, entropy, it's quantum theories. Then you have chemical theories, which is all based in the table of elements, that is the atomic numbers. And then you have biological theories, which all emerge out of the notion of genetics and its relationship to the environment or the surrounding systems. So the logical part of this requires then for the dictionary of terms to use the causal consequences of events with a number of terms related to logic, logical terms that all are derived. In this case, I've purposely derived these terms from the notion of ducere, the Latin word which means to lead to. So the forms of induction, adduction, deduction, production, retroduction, etc., are all come from the same Latin root. I intend to use them here all in the meaning of the notion of a function, the notion of a mathematical function, or related to a mathematical function. So this is the set of terms which can be used to proceed from the antecedents to the consequences, from the inorganic to the organic. If you need a slogan to deal with this level of synthesis, there's two of them that are available in the slide. One on the bottom right side is the word synduction, which is a word I've created to relate to the Aristotelian notion of synthesis. So it's a leading of bringing together the parts into the whole. On the left-hand side, Whitehead's word of concrescence is the spirit of these terms, if you would, and the simple sentence, if you would, the grounding sentence for the terms on the right-hand side are the union of units unite the unity of the universe. And this is just a slogan which tries to bring different parts of the whole together into a unity. And I previously mentioned C.S. Peirce. Okay, so the first notion to bring forth is that scientific notations of mathematics, are these scientific notations sufficient, or what other sorts of terms? This is rather different view of the role of mathematics than Herbert Simon proposes in terms of modularity. Rather than starting with a modularity and decomposing the system into modules, or decomposing a general theory into sub-theories and sub-sub-theories, I'm rather starting at a different notion, that is the notion of the mathematical composition of parts into wholes, that is, in a simple sense, addition. so that we have the antecedent dictionary of mathematics and physics. And these are two different dictionaries, two different languages, two different ways of representing a system or well, leave it at that. It's two different ways of doing it, two different languages, two different sets of symbols, and two different sets of constraints on how the symbols are used. The proof of natural identity distinguishes formal relevant logic of mathematics from orthodox mathematics and physics. So the notions of orthodox mathematics and really set theory and the foundations of putative foundations of natural mathematics are very general in nature. The terminology of mathematics, such as modules or functions or this, are its particular language based on the concept of variables that is extremely general. On the other side, and hence, you have difficulty establishing relationships between the language of mathematics and the language of the natural sciences. By here, I mean the languages of chemistry, biology, and higher order compositions. The second point is that rather than the antecedent dictionary for chemistry is constrained. It's constrained to the table of elements, and the table of elements is the basis for all of the deductions and inductions, adductions, abductions, synductions that become the logic of chemistry that is consistent with the atomic numbers, that is the mathematics of the physical representation of chemical elements. So the antecedent notations here then are rather different for these three domains of language, these three ways to express ourselves about our relationships with nature and the natural sciences. The consequences of these three languages, antecedent notations, are attempted and humorously represented in terms of the spider and the spider's web of complexification. The notions here then are related on the left-hand side of the table in terms of units of notation. We have electrical units for physical particles, atomic units for chemical particles, and atomic numbers for units of being, units of existence, units of composition. Corresponding with these notions of units are the natural sciences theories of chemical quanta theory, which actually for those familiar with the history of science, physical quantum mechanics originally developed from chemical theory. That is, Schrodinger equation was for the hydrogen atom. It was not for mass itself. And correspondingly, physical theory of thermodynamics was developed solely on the steam engine and the behavior of gases without any chemical change. So chemical thermodynamics, on the other hand, develops from the notion of the combination of atoms into molecules, atomic sentences into molecular sentences, chemical equilibrium constant, which should be comparable to economic equilibrium. And for that, the distinction here that is a crucial part for the composition of chemical systems or living systems is the notion of syntropy. That is, for work, this term of syntropy was originally proposed back in the 1940s by an Italian mathematician as complementary to the notion of entropy. Well, in biological science systems, syntropy becomes the dominant thing under control, cybernetic control, because it is through the control of syntropy, the cyclic processes of synthesization of chemical systems or molecular biological systems into a living system. So that I'll move forward here. When we now want to extend our base of languages to biology, that is living systems, we also then have to increase our antecedent dictionaries and our antecedent sets of relevant logics. In terms of units, we have to add genetic units to the philosophy of our view. And in terms of the numbering system, we now have to change to giving formal names to the chemical elements as mathematical objects, which I call the perplex numbers. So these are necessary things to create the relational logic of the representation of the scientific notations of individual identity. Now, the crucial term here in the meaning of this is the notion of the individual entities of biology or of the natural sciences. The individual identity is essential to the description of every chemical element. The difference that makes a difference between chemical elements is their identity, that is their physical properties, their atomic number, etc. The order that is created in biology is not a simple order of the atomic units. It is the, if you would, heteropathic organization of the order that is intrinsic to the table of elements. So we're separating two different notions of order here. One, the order of mathematics, physics, and chemistry being grounded in simple linear sequential symbols representing numbers, integers, and biological organization in which the ground or it rests on the physical, chemical, and mathematical notions of number, but they create a new organization of these numbers. And this notion is captured in terms of the logical terms that are used to describe it. These are the relevant logical terms in terms of formal logic, and they become the basis for the language of biology, so that all the parts of the whole of the biology, the anatomy of all living systems, is described in terms of this new organization. This can be expressed in terms, for example, of permutation groups of atoms, permutation groups of atomic numbers, permutation groups of any structure you can compose mathematically from atoms. So the consequent dictionary then, which gets back to the basic parts of the consequences here are something that are of keen interest to my own personal work in research, and that is you need all of these four languages to come up with a consequence dictionary for the practice of medicine and for public health. I missed this slide. So the emergence of heteropathic organic mathematics is a consequence of the antecedent mathematics of the atomic numbers. Now, I've dwelt on this at some extent verbally. This slide simply gives a similar thing view now expressed in terms of semantics. We'll just take the middle lines here because that's necessary, or gets the essence of the message across for this group. So the atomic numbers can be represented either mathematically as a simple integer, and these are all constrained to small numbers. like there's only 92 natural elements. Secondly, they can be represented as physical objects with chemical and physical and thermodynamic and quantum mechanical properties. These is a second way of representing atoms. And the third part is that you can represent them then as parts of molecules or parts of any higher order system. So you have three different ways of representation, and these more or less correspond with the modularization that Lucille focused on in terms of the development of theory. But now we're talking in terms of representation in terms of three different scientific notational systems and three different notions of logic, that is abductive logic of C.F. Peirce, additive logic of physics, and the productive logic of chemistry, that is going from atoms to molecules. What is added to this symbolization is that atoms as physical objects are necessarily occupying volume, occupying space, so that when you add atoms together, you come up with larger objects, spatial objects, and these spatial objects will have a spatial form to them. This spatial form is describable, obviously, in terms of the physics of space groups, and that gives them their form that is consistent with that. What this implies, the spatial addition of atoms, is not only that you must give them form, that is, they acquire new information, but in addition, you need a locative logic to put them in place so that you can recognize the organization of different molecules, even though they have many similar properties. So this spatial adduction is very crucial to the language of chemistry, the language of isomers, the language of handedness that is essential to biological function. And then finally, the electrical forces of the atom, the physical constituents of the atom, represent the conductivity relationships, the electrical conductivity relationships within molecules and with all compositions of molecules, so that this conductive logic moves or is essential to not only the formation of molecules and their spectral activities, physical activities, but also to biological electrical activity, such as that manifests itself in consciousness, or in general, any organization of living systems is always sensitive to the electrical forces that exist about it. The other part of this trilingual symbolization of atomic sentences is that it imposes a relevant obligatory logic that is necessary to be satisfied in order to create the identity. And to do this semantically, you need to match the subjects of the sentence with the predicates of the sentence. And this matching of the atomic numbers in the precursors to the predicates in the consequence of the molecular sentence is absolutely crucial to the logic of biology and to higher orders of relationships. So the question then of if you have order in mathematics and physics related to sequential numbering, then the obligatory logic of chemistry requires both the sequential numbering aspects of the notations, as well as the organizational consequence of the matching of subjects and predicates. So both are necessary. Neither alone is sufficient for the notation of chemistry. So the last part is that these matchings of terminology, what I've said is all as a consequence of looking at the chemical terminology, standard basic chemical terminology of molecular weight, formula, molecular number, structure, and handedness can be expressed in terms of categorical diagrams, of logical categorical diagrams. And so there is a simple one-to-one correspondence between the parts of the whole, that is the atoms in the atomic sentences, with the parts of the whole of the molecular sentence. The difference between them is the organization of the parts of the whole. And finally, the asymmetry, I won't dwell on it, it's just necessary for handedness, which is essential to biological catalysis. So in summary and overview and closure, with the propositional terms of relational logic of third order biocybernetics is expressed in the view on the right-hand side, the box on the right-hand side. There are boundaries of the meanings of the languages of the propositional terms. Now, this is the essence of what I wanted to say today. That is, if you start out with the notion of scientific dictionaries based in scientific notations and the meaning of these, then there are boundaries of the meanings of the propositional terms, and that these boundaries vary with the scientific notation. So the physical notation has meaning in regard to the fundamental constants of physics, or fundamental physical units of mass, electricity, distance, temperature, time. Okay, so mathematics has no physical meaning in and of its symbol system and its notation. It can be applied to anything. Mathematics can be applied to anything. It's a source of counting. Secondly,
yes,
physical terminology and laws of physics grounded in both mass, or Newton's law and Coulomb's law, electricity and mass, also have constraints on the mathematics which can be applied. And so the meaning of physical, the strict logical meaning of physics is constrained by the meanings of physical units. The same applies to chemistry. The meaning of chemical terminology, the meaning of the propositional terms of chemistry, the meanings of the propositional terms of third order biocybernetics is constrained by the meaning of chemistry as modulated or as influenced as being a consequence of numbering. So that these are all three meanings are associated. The propositional terms of these three notations are associated with each other, but they have an accretion of meaning as you move up the scale here, up the description. And finally, the same applies to biological system. It's dependent on the meanings of the mathematical, physical, and chemical terminology that is used to describe the living system. And yet, the biological terminology is constrained by the scientific notations of the sciences from which it is composed. So this accretion of meaning is here to be taken very directly in relation to the open meanings and the problems of communication and the construction of conversations within the sciences and between and among the sciences. This is often this problem of communication in cybernetics and in business and in all domains is a question that is often phrased in terms of silos, that different silos are not speaking to each other. So this accretion of meaning, I coined the term more out of humor than anything else, of ensilogization, which is an agricultural term. of making silage by letting things ferment together. So that question then becomes of meaning and how you associate meaning in general system sciences requires then some notion of correspondence between the antecedent dictionaries used in mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology with the corresponding dictionaries of the identities. So you go from very general dictionaries of the individual sciences to the identities of part-whole relationships in the corresponding dictionary terms. And so this synthesis of meaning of dictionaries to give individual identity is the consequence of this view of nature. And I take it this is a view of the natural sciences and my understanding of the natural sciences of today. I have stopped there with, except for one final comment, that is that the development of this worldview of the natural sciences has been a consequence of my efforts to understand mathematical biology and the notion of mutation, where mutation is change, change in existence of being. So that the notion of a mathematical function here is symbolizes change, just as the notion of physical change is symbolized by a mathematical function. The notion of chemical change is then considered to be a mutation because it follows different order relationships. The biological notion of change, of a mutation, is that of a change of being of the organism. So that sort of covers everything I wanted to say, and I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Jerry, what's QQTTT on the top corner?
Pardon?
On the top right of your slides, that's in QQTTT.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's blocked out on my screen because of the all your beautiful pictures of you all individuals. So it's PPPT is QQTTT, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I misunderstood what you said, Jason. So Q is quantity.
Quantity.
Q, quality.
Quality.
T is term. T is temperature. And T is thesis. That is the hypothesis for how these are connected.
Aha. Good.
Okay, so
More
it's just
questions?
an acronym.
Okay. More questions, please.
Jerry, I want to congratulate you. I've been working with you for 15 years, and this is the clearest presentation of your endeavors I have heard. Thank you. What is important about what you're doing, now I come from the cultural anthropology and cognitive sciences world. This is an opportunity for cybernetics to be reflexive, to go against, for however you want to say it, with science as a paradigm, as a language. So we look at the assumption sets of the world that is speeding us towards artificial intelligence, machine learning. And it gives us a tool to look at the limitations of the suppositions and assumptions that we're going towards a horizon of a limited vocabulary, a limited dictionary, and inadequate means of understanding living systems. So the ability to look at your beautiful term of molecular sentences changes linguistics from me and my language, you and your language, to something that can reference languaging and organization of a language in a discipline called science. So we're going back to what was in the 1700s natural science and natural philosophy. You're giving us the ability to bring those together. Thank you.
I would point out that this view has been very strongly influenced by one of my colleagues, Harold Morowitz at George Mason University. Harold focused on the notion of natural philosophy and its relationships to the work of consciousness in the Krasnow Institute for Advanced Study. This Harold Morowitz's book, which recently, I don't have the name of it at the tip of my tongue, but it provides the very extensive, like 500 pages analysis of the role of physics and chemistry in the emergence of life, using the deep ocean springs, currents, to form the basis for the initial emergence of life. And if you want to look at how these factors emerged over eons of time, the history of the Earth, then that is a book to provide that level of notion. And all of this is necessary to get to the notion of syntropy as being critical to biological evolution.
Can I ask a question, Jay?
Sure.
Yes, Lloyd, please.
I have listened to this before. Let me first raise the simple question. Meyerowitz is the guy from medium theory. Is that the same? But
I'm sorry, I missed the term, Luke.
Is Meyerowitz, is that from medium theory, or is that another one? Or you were calling someone Meyerowitz who was a colleague of yours? I'm interested. Let me come to my question first, then it becomes clear.
I can't understand you, Luke. You have to.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll turn up my microphone. I have listened a couple of times to your presentation in different settings, and I always don't really get it. And I was wondering whether you have written a beautiful book where I can really read it.
Lut, I've been working on I moved to Minnesota 10 years ago to write that book. And the book is still being born. It's coming along beautifully, but I would say that I'm a hell of a lot closer to it now than I was 10 years ago, but I can't make any promises when it will appear.
Do you have an introductory chapter?
Pardon?
Introduction chapter.
Chapter 1, is that available? As an introduction?
No, there's a number of papers in the literature that address various parts of it, and perhaps the most recent, but there's nothing that brings this level of synthesis together.
Okay.
As this talk motivated me to bring it together.
Okay.
Heiner?
Yeah.
Thank you, Jerry. I liked your approach to natural sciences and biology, but in multilingual approaches with UN, we separated natural sciences, life sciences, and humanities. And so I'm very much more close to where Lowell is with his interest. And I would like to point you out that we, with the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research in Altenberg in Austria, have had a whole year a series on emergence and the psychology of the humans, on how to really bring the humanities, as you say, and this and the different annotations and conceptualizations there together. I have it all in the Encyclopedia of Systems and Cybernetics with Charles Francois, but I just wanted to point you out. I can give a link into the chat, but maybe it's another topic. We shouldn't delve with it now.
Oh, Heiner, I enjoyed your presentation last week, and I'm familiar with the Altenberg Institute. I visited there, maybe 2 decades ago, and think they're doing fine work. If you're looking for that linkage, then I would suggest the linkage that you relate to the natural sciences to the humanities is through the notation for music. The notation for music gives this sense of rhythm to nature. It gives a sense of rhythm to the symbol system. And
Okay.
how the notation for music becomes an emotional event for the listener. Okay, that is, I think, well, it strongly influenced my view on what the notation of chemistry means. So it's a question of how do you give meanings to notations? And the notation for music is a quantitative notation. It is also a qualitative notation. It is also a temporal notation. And obviously there are a huge variety of musical terms which relate these various things. The hypothesis of good music is the hypothesis of something that's well composed from these variables.
Thank you. It is
Okay.
a whole.
Secondly, okay.
So,
Secondly, I worked for 10 years in the National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke, and I published papers in the area of epilepsy and the consequences of loss of control of the brain, which leads to epileptic seizures, and the control circuits in the brain, that is the cybernetics of the brain, feedback and feed forward mechanisms, are just absolutely unimaginably complex. We don't have the slightest idea of how to even count the number of control circuits in the brain. Not even the vaguest idea of how to count these control circuits, because they are based on the enormous interactions of quanta of electrical interactions. And when you lose that enormous set of interactions, what you get is a seizure with the rhythmic behavior of seizures.
What is
Okay.
important about what you're saying there, Jerry, an article just came out about the neurological organization. A neuron is an information processing complexity. It's not a Shannon A to B. It actually processes information pre-conceptually, and that is a level of organization you're referencing in terms of epilepsy and the ability to understand rhythm or improvisation as an emergent phenomenon. That, I mean, those are topics we as cyberneticians need to be talking about.
just
Jenny.
let me just jump in, because I think otherwise this thread is not following up. You see, this was 96 and 97, and we really in this whole year work looked also into music and other kinds of cultural expressions. And I happen to be the secretary of the Tagore Einstein Council. It's a foundation in India, and Einstein and Tagore could only communicate via mathematics and music. So I'm really deep into that. And we worked with what we call the cognitive panorama on bringing the different sign systems according to Peirce together, symbol, icon, and index. But to bring them into a common solution space, we say we have to bring system sciences and general model theory or model sciences together, not mathematical models, but build extensional, immersive, fantasy virtual models. Anyway, just wanted to say, I feel as one, I'm very happy to meet you.
Well, Heiner, you'll be interested to know then that recently, and I mean like 3 or 4 months ago, I finally deciphered C.S. Peirce's notion of the trichotomy. That is, qualisigns, synsign, and legisign in terms of its meaning in chemistry at the time, excuse me, in terms of the modern meaning of chemistry. And I firmly believe that C.S. Peirce's notion of the trichotomy, which is the foundation of much of his thinking, emerged from his notions of chemistry as they existed in the second half of the 19th century. So that this was very, very pleasing to me, because it took me a better part of 20 years to understand what C.S. Peirce was talking about.
Okay, with the Uxkul people, we looked very much into the index, not just the symbol and the icon.
Jamie.
May I propose, Jason, if before I ask my question, would you be willing to consider organizing a session next week in which to give your presentation? Because I noticed it's 20 minutes to 1. And the discussion is very interesting.
Well, I just made a decision to move my own presentation back to August.
August. Okay.
So we can give, because Lucy and Jerry has brought us very heavy and very important content that we really need to give them a thorough discussion. Yes, so please go ahead and talk about your points. And I would like to invite Lucy to make some connections with Jerry, and like the connection between these two presentations.
All right. My point, actually, it's something in the slide, is with your Q, Q, T, 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 and pairs and everything. Where is ethics? And there's also a little bit in response to Heiner. There's all that research in psychology or systems thinking. Does the ethical question needs to be somewhere very clearly that we don't lose it? And now, Jerry, I have like a proposal. It may be wrong, but when I look at your slide and I see correspondence dictionaries, I'm catapulted back to the beginning of the 20th century, the discussions in the Vienna Circle. Heiner, I don't know whether you attended the celebration of the Tractatus, that was like 2 weeks ago, I guess, in Vienna. Just that it was published 100 years ago. So, just in those discussions, there was some discussion about the role of convention in how we decide how to use the signs. And so that correspondence relation is like at the same time a conventional, but also an ethical obligation to not cheat or lie or secretly change the conventions or the rules that are being used. So I'm proposing, and I don't know whether I'm wrong in seeing that, does that the correspondence dictionaries, that's where the question of ethics like starts showing up, but maybe also in other places, in terms of the commitment that we make to honor the rules of the dictionary, and not to change the rules without at the minimum telling that we're changing the rules, in terms of how we attach meanings, or just connect the abstract with reality. So I'm just curious what the response is to that proposal.
Well, it would seem to me, if you look at this slide, my slides are still up, I take it. The open meanings are the connectivity that is managed by each of us. In other words, when we speak with someone else, that open meaning is there. And whether this will be consistent with where we're at tomorrow or the next day, or whether it's consistent of what we said a week ago or 2 weeks ago, it's very much an issue of human character, of human capabilities, of human intelligence, of human knowledge. What we communicate is what we what we physiologically express and manifest in our body motions, in our languages, in our music, etc. But how someone else interprets that depend on to what extent they share the same capabilities of languaging, etc.
So, but what I want to say is not just a function of how they share, that there is a moral commitment that we make, or that we have a moral responsibility to, first of all, say everything that we are thinking, including our doubts, but also to ask questions when we do not understand something, and also to check in with another, whether there is actually a communication channel that has been opened, or
Okay, let me say, okay, Jamie, let me say the following, which comes from a mathematical side of things. For 10 years, I taught a course at the National Institutes of Health called Chaotic, Cyclic, and Oscillatory Processes in Biology and Medicine, in which my understanding of mathematics developed from exploring very deeply the relationship between biology and chaos theory and catastrophe theory. So that in this context, the slides that I have presented here today are almost completely devoid of anything to do with dynamics.
okay.
I mean, I have purposely skirted that issue because it opens up all sorts of other questions. And I agree that these are very pertinent and relevant questions, particularly to the practice of cyberneticians. Okay, as I understand how at least this group of cyberneticians responds to various situations, business ethics, in other words, I haven't addressed those questions at all. And it was not my intent to address those questions. I mean, I could do it if, you know, it could be done.
All right.
It would
Okay.
require another batch of slides and a lot more work. But I think the question of integrity, human integrity, of scientific integrity, is such a deep and profound question that I really would think most philosophers don't really grasp what it's about even. At least that's my impression of what I read from philosophers, particularly some of the philosophers who deal with quantum physics and attempt to express their notions about the meaning of the mathematics of quantum physics. These people don't have much scientific integrity from my perspective. It really is, I think I don't want to say that they're unethical. I really don't want to say that. But I think their limited understanding of what it means to be human and to participate in a human society is so bounded by their notion of mathematics and physics that they're causing harm in the society at large.
Lucio.
Yeah, it's interesting because just linking at this first point with which Jerry was saying, is just reminds me to how important was in how to say in shaping mainstream economics its very birth, which was explicitly declared to make the Newtonian physics applied to individuals. So the explicitly explicit project of Léon Barras, let's say the most important founder of economics, was just to replicate what Newtonian physics did for physical phenomena to into economics, and translate it in terms of individuals as atoms and as the elementary units of the model, just deprived of any aspect concerning ethics, concerning, moral values, or what was not just reducible to the mathematics exactly into the Newtonian structure. And this birth as conditioned, as constrained all the, it's now is, the Varra model where in 1875, something like that. And it was still after 100 years conditioning very much the development of economics, at least of mainstream economics.
Yeah, Lucia, I agree with you. I'm aware of that mathematics and the very direct assumptions of Newtonian physics going directly into economic equations is tragic. I mean, it steered our society, or the societies, at a political level in a way that is unconscionable, in my view. I mean, it's just fantastic that the mathematics of physics should be so abused into running human systems. I just find it incredible.
Exactly, I totally agree with you. And by the way, the further mathematization of economic theory was also hiding all this type of assumptions under a pyramid of hard mathematics for most people. That was just a way to let's say, to blanket the whole structure of the theory, the whole structure of the discipline.
Exactly. I mean, but this is very common in the professional world. It's not just the economists that do this. The physicians do it very often, and it's when I think perhaps the words that come to mind is that of a philosopher who said in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And the economist with physical equations has one eye on mathematics, and the rest of the economists didn't have their eyes open.
Exactly.
So you want to say something?
And just one more observation, that is, it's interesting that then there is a fracture between what this, let's say, body of mathematical economics is considered as the foundations, and what is neoliberalism. I mean, because it's interesting that neoliberalism takes some specific the foundational body, but using, how to say, disentangling these specific points from the rest of the theory, and using just properly for the aims of neoliberalism. That is just justifying inequality, hard inequality, justifying for this. Just to give you an example that it's for me was always very interesting. In a pure economic equilibrium model, by the way, Varra was a socialist, and not only Varra, but also others. And it was clear that to make all to make the true competition and to reward people according to their capacities, there had to be, how to say, the legacy taxes 100%, just to be all people equal. So it was to put taxes, it was impossible to inherit anything from the parents, just to keep all the people the same. But
Okay.
that
Okay.
neoliberalism, forget this part of the story, forget this part of the theory, of the foundational theory.
Your mic is dropping again.
And uses it just for specific aims. I mean,
Okay.
just
Lucille, let me respond to this by offering a challenge to Bob Knisely. I've changed the list or the slide over to the logical syntax of cause-effect relationships on the right-hand side of this slide, and the relationship to scientific notations. So I think Bob and perhaps whoever else is up to the challenge could take that logical syntax and apply it to economic systems and the mathematics of economic systems. All of those logical terms are foundational for the sciences, and they offer an opportunity to provide a very direct linkage between cause and effect relationships within economics and the natural sciences. So my off the top of the head conjecture is that a theory of economics would take this set of cause-effect relationships and relate it to the concept of money.
I don't see how you could do that. So one of the discussions I've been having with Lucio is, where do economic systems exist? And my argument has always been that any economic system you look at, there is a moral system sitting underneath it somewhere. And on that, there are various types, there are moral frameworks. So what you consider to be fair could be one of quite a number of options, but you don't allow for, you've got to allow in any human transaction between people of spite, of jealousy, of all these human emotions. Now, if you're trying to put mathematical formulas onto human emotions, then you might be able to succeed. But underlying any economic system are human emotions. You desperately need something I have, and I don't like you, so I put the price up. How do you account for all of that sort of behavior?
I account for that as being a research problem that you probably should address.
There is another way to or maybe it's exactly what Jonathan is trying to say, is that every paradigm or every theory has associated with it an ethical paradigm or an ethical theory, because that in ethics there are a huge amount of different paradigms, and they all very nicely map on a scientific worldview or cosmology. So everyone is very ethical, but they're all ethical according to their paradigm. And so we really need a way of integrating our ethical presuppositions into whatever a framework that we're discussing here, such as I believe that Jerry in the back of his mind has an ethical framework that is totally consistent with everything that he wrote here, and then maybe he can add as a slide. And the same thing for Lucio and for Jason.
Jerry, you had used this word synductive, and you also used the syntropy, and you mentioned syntropinization. Could you say a little bit more about them?
So yes, and this actually is very related to what Jamie just said as well. and the questions of ethics involved. And as a way of background, I would say that I've had a side interest in theology ever since I was a boy. And so I'm not unfamiliar with the slipperiness of ethical questions and their relationship to human behavior. Been there, done that sort of thing, Jamie. And so with that, I would say, so what is synduction? First of all, the notion of sin means to bring together. And so synduction here means to bring together the parts of the whole. And in that context, so it's what leads to the parts of the whole becoming one, the oneness of, if you would, the molecular sentence.
So what's the difference between synduction and syntropy? And you said syntropy.
Okay, so let me continue. So synduction is a product or is a consequence of the obligatory relationships, ethical obligatory relationships. Okay, so that the obligatory relationships that accompany synduction are syntropy. That is, when the parts are brought together, work is done. So syntropy was the term used for work as contrasted with entropy.
Can you measure that?
It's the organization. So syntropy then is the word that would be accompany the notion of the identity of the new molecule of the molecular sentence. So
is that possible that you measure? Is that possible that you measure syntropy like, well, Shannon measured entropy as information? I mean, negative entropy as information. So, so how do you do that with the syntropy?
Okay, you do it within the perplex number system, and you do it by counting up the number of new relationships that have been formed among the atoms. So it's a relational term as well. You count the number of relations that are necessary to make the whole from the parts. And these are new relationships. They're emergent relationships between the parts of the whole that create the unity of the whole.
Heiner, you have something to say?
Yes.
Is that clear what the intended?
Pretty good.
What Margareta just asked, I have to give another reference. You see, we with the Council of Europe, new ideas in science and art, new spaces for culture and society, have been meeting with Laszlo, Dalai Lama, Havel in the castle in Prague to really look into paradigms and meta-paradigms, because we in Europe always looked into all the various national and subject languages. And I will add also this link to this proposal for a meta-paradigm, because when you make concrete as a pointer to possibilities, as Anthony Judge from the UIA called it, then you have a macroscopic index, and then you can bring micro and meso and macroscopic together. Nothing more. I really enjoy this group.
One of the issues that seems to be missing in our discussion on objects is the notion of parameters and paradigms that form the metastructure that allows an interaction of objects and interactions of components that are functional. And that's what I like about Lucia's thing, is that there are groupings, functional groupings of parts that can't be reduced just to the part.
Bob, do you want to answer Jerry's question?
I answered in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions for today? Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so pleased. Okay, so come back on August.
Jason, thank you very much for being tolerant and postponing your own talk. I mean,
I'm just
very gracious of you. It's very gracious of you.
See you next week. No. See you next month. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye.